Barbara Brown sat in the familiar warmth of her son's living room, surrounded by cherished family photos adorning the walls. Despite the cozy ambience, an undercurrent of tension lingered in the air, threatening to disrupt the fragile peace she had desperately tried to maintain. As she sipped her tea, Barbara couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her ever since her son James married Jennifer. Gone were the days of laughter and shared meals. Now, every interaction felt strained, as if walking on eggshells to avoid setting off an explosive argument. Barbara glanced across the room at Jennifer, who sat stiffly on the sofa, her eyes fixed on her phone screen. Despite her attempts to engage in polite conversation, Jennifer's responses were curt and distant, leaving Barbara feeling increasingly isolated within her own family. "Jennifer, would you like some more tea?" Barbara offered, hoping to break the icy silence that had descended between them. Jennifer looked up from her phone, her expression guarded. "No, thank you, Barbara, I'm fine." Barbara sighed inwardly, feeling the weight of Jennifer's unspoken resentment hanging heavy in the air. She longed for the easy rapport they once shared, but it seemed that Jennifer was determined to keep her at arm's length. "Is everything all right, dear?" Barbara ventured, her voice gentle with concern. Jennifer's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Everything's fine, Barbara. I just have a lot on my mind." Barbara bit back the urge to press further, sensing that Jennifer was not in the mood for idle conversation. Instead, she turned her attention back to her tea, the strained atmosphere casting a shadow over the once happy home. As the evening wore on, the tension between Barbara and Jennifer only seemed to grow, each passing moment serving as a stark reminder of the growing divide within their family. And as Barbara retired to her room for the night, she couldn't help but wonder how they had ended up in such a fragile state, and what it would take to mend the fractured bonds that once held them together. As days turned into weeks, the unspoken resentments between Barbara and Jennifer continued to fester, casting a dark shadow over the once harmonious household. Barbara found herself tiptoeing around Jennifer's volatile moods, never knowing what minor infraction would set off a storm of anger. Despite Barbara's best efforts to bridge the gap between them, Jennifer remained distant and aloof, her resentment palpable in every interaction. The atmosphere of the house grew increasingly strained, with tension simmering just beneath the surface like a pot ready to boil over. Barbara sighed as she scrubbed dishes at the sink, her mind heavy with worry. She couldn't understand why Jennifer seemed so determined to keep her at arm's length, or why simple tasks like cleaning and cooking had become battlegrounds for their silent war. "Is there anything I can help with, Barbara?" James's voice broke through her thoughts, and Barbara turned to see her son standing in the doorway, concern etched into his features. Barbara forced a smile, trying to hide the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her shoulders. "No, darling, I'm fine, just finishing up here." James frowned, his brow furrowing with worry. "Mom, I can see that something's not right. You and Jennifer seem to be at odds more often than not these days. Is there anything I can do to help?" Barbara hesitated, torn between wanting to protect her son from the tension brewing between her and Jennifer and longing to confide in him about the growing rift in their family. "It's just, Jennifer and I seem to be having trouble finding common ground," Barbara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore, James. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around her, afraid to say or do anything that might set her off." James' expression softened with understanding, and he stepped forward to wrap his arms around his mother in a comforting embrace. "I'm sorry, Mom. I had hoped that things would improve once we were all living together, but it seems that Jennifer's resentment runs deeper than I realized." Barbara felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her as she leaned into her son's embrace, grateful for his unwavering support. In that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. But as the days passed and the tension between Barbara and Jennifer continued to escalate, Barbara couldn't shake the sinking feeling that their fragile peace was teetering on the edge of collapse, and that the worst was yet to come. The weight of the tension between Barbara and Jennifer became increasingly unbearable, leaving Barbara feeling like a stranger in her own home. Every interaction with Jennifer seemed to end in frustration, with Barbara struggling to maintain her composure in the face of Jennifer's relentless hostility. One evening, as Barbara sat alone in her room, the walls closing in around her, she knew that something had to change. She couldn't continue living in a state of constant turmoil, tiptoeing around Jennifer's volatile moods and feeling like an unwelcome guest in her own son's house. With a heavy heart, Barbara made the difficult decision to leave. She knew that it wouldn't be easy to uproot herself from the comfort and familiarity of her son's home, but she also knew that she couldn't continue sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of maintaining an illusion of peace. The next morning, Barbara sat down with James to discuss her decision. She could see the concern in her son's eyes as she explained her reasons for wanting to move out, but she also sensed a glimmer of understanding in his gaze. "Mom, I hate to see you struggling like this," James said, his voice filled with genuine concern. "If moving out is what you need to do to find peace and happiness, then I support your decision 100%. Tears welled up in Barbara's eyes as she reached out to squeeze her son's hand. "Thank you, James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I just can't bear the thought of continuing to live like this, feeling like a burden in my own home." James pulled his mother into a tight embrace, his arms a comforting anchor in the midst of her turmoil. "You're not a burden, Mom," he said softly. "You're the heart and soul of this family, and we'll support you no matter what." With James's unwavering support bolstering her resolve, Barbara began the daunting task of packing up her belongings, steeling herself for the inevitable confrontation with Jennifer and the uncertain road that lay ahead. But as she took the first steps toward reclaiming her independence and finding peace within herself, Barbara knew that she was making the right decision for her own well-being, no matter how difficult it may be. As Barbara settled into her new apartment, she hoped for a fresh start, free from the constant tension that had plagued her life at her son's house. However, her hopes were quickly dashed when Jennifer began to intrude upon her newfound sanctuary with unsettling frequency. It started with occasional visits, Jennifer appearing unannounced and making herself at home as if she owned the place. At first, Barbara tried to brush off the intrusions, hoping that Jennifer would eventually get the hint and respect her boundaries. But as the visits became more frequent, Barbara's patience wore thin, and she began to feel like a prisoner in her own home. One evening, as Barbara sat down to enjoy a quiet dinner, there was a knock at the door. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, she opened the door to find Jennifer standing on the doorstep, a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "Hi, Barbara," Jennifer said breezily, breezing past Barbara and into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by for a visit." Barbara's jaw tightened with frustration, but she forced a polite smile, determined not to let Jennifer get under her skin. "Jennifer, I appreciate the gesture, but I was just about to sit down for dinner. Perhaps we can catch up another time." Jennifer's smirk widened into a knowing grin as she made herself comfortable on the couch. "Oh, don't mind me, Barbara. I won't stay long. I just thought I'd keep you company." Barbara clenched her fists at her sides, her patience wearing thin. She knew that confronting Jennifer would only escalate the situation, but she couldn't shake off the feeling of intrusion that lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. As the evening wore on, Barbara found herself growing increasingly agitated, unable to relax in her own home with Jennifer's presence looming over her like a dark cloud. And as she retired to bed that night, she couldn't shake off the sinking feeling that Jennifer's unexpected intrusions were only the beginning of a much larger battle yet to come. The tension between Barbara and Jennifer reached a boiling point, culminating in a long-awaited confrontation that would change the dynamics of their relationship forever. Barbara could no longer tolerate Jennifer's constant intrusions into her new apartment and decided it was time to assert her boundaries. One afternoon, as Barbara sat at her kitchen table, sipping on a cup of tea, she heard a knock at the door. Steeling herself for what she knew would be another uninvited visit from Jennifer, Barbara took a deep breath and opened the door. Sure enough, Jennifer stood on the doorstep, her expression haughty and self-assured. "Barbara, I need to talk to you about something," she said, pushing her way into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. Barbara felt her patience wearing thin as she watched Jennifer make herself at home on the couch. "Jennifer, this isn't a good time," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady despite the rising tide of frustration. "I have things I need to take care of." Jennifer waved her hand dismissively, a smug smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Oh, don't be silly, Barbara. This won't take long. I just wanted to talk to you about the rent for this apartment." Barbara's heart skipped a beat as she felt the familiar surge of anger rising within her. She had known that this conversation was coming, but she hadn't been prepared for the sheer audacity of Jennifer's demands. "Jennifer, I think it's time we had a little chat," Barbara said, her voice calm but firm, as she crossed the room to stand in front of Jennifer. "You seem to have some misconceptions about who's responsible for paying the rent for this apartment." Jennifer's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of confusion. "What do you mean, Barbara? Isn't James paying the rent for this place?" Barbara shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "No, Jennifer, he's not. I've been paying the rent for this apartment out of my own pocket. And it's time you realize that." Jennifer's eyes widened in shock, her mouth falling open in disbelief. But that's not fair. Why should you have to pay for this place when James is the one who wanted us to live here?" Barbara's patience snapped, her voice rising with anger as she faced off against Jennifer. "Because, Jennifer, I refuse to be a pawn in your game any longer. I've worked hard to build a life for myself, and I won't let you take that away from me. If you want to live here so badly, then you can start paying your own way." With that, Barbara turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Jennifer speechless and shaken in her wake. As she retreated to the sanctuary of her bedroom, Barbara couldn't shake off the feeling of satisfaction that washed over her. She had finally stood up to Jennifer and asserted her independence, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. After the confrontation with Jennifer regarding the rent for the apartment, Barbara braced herself for the inevitable fallout. She knew that her decision to assert her boundaries would have repercussions, but she refused to back down in the face of Jennifer's manipulation any longer. As the days passed, tension hung heavy in the air between Barbara, Jennifer, and James. Barbara could sense the strain in their interactions, each conversation fraught with unspoken resentment and simmering anger. One evening, as Barbara sat alone in her apartment, her phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. With a sense of trepidation, she answered the call, steeling herself for whatever news awaited her on the other end. "Mom, it's James," came her son's voice, sounding weary and defeated. "I need to talk to you about what happened with Jennifer." Barbara's heart sank at the mention of Jennifer's name, knowing that their confrontation had set off a chain reaction that would impact their family dynamic for years to come. "What is it, James?" Barbara asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the flood of emotions swirling inside her. James sighed heavily, the weight of the situation evident in his words. "Mom, I've decided to divorce Jennifer," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. "I can't continue living like this, constantly at odds with each other. It's not fair to either of us." Barbara felt a surge of mixed emotions wash over her at her son's words. On one hand, she felt a sense of relief, knowing that James was finally taking steps to free himself from Jennifer's toxic influence. On the other hand, she couldn't shake off the guilt that weighed heavily on her conscience, knowing that her actions had played a part in their marital breakdown. "James, I'm so sorry," Barbara said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted things to end this way, but I couldn't stand by and watch you suffer any longer. You deserve to be happy. And if divorcing Jennifer is what it takes to find that happiness, then I support your decision 100%. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before James spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. "Thanks, Mom. I just wish things could have turned out differently." As Barbara hung up the phone, she couldn't shake off the feeling of sadness that settled over her like a dark cloud. Despite knowing that James's decision was for the best, she couldn't help but mourn the loss of the happy family she had once dreamed of. But as she gazed out the window at the city skyline bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Barbara felt a flicker of hope stirring inside her. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she and James would face them together as a family, their bond stronger than ever before. And as she settled into bed for the night, Barbara allowed herself to believe that brighter days were on the horizon, ready to embrace whatever the future held in store. With Jennifer out of the picture and James's decision to divorce her, Barbara found herself facing a new chapter in her life with a mixture of relief and apprehension. As she settled into her new routine in her apartment, she knew that it was time to focus on moving forward and rebuilding her life. One morning, as Barbara sipped her coffee and gazed out the window at the bustling city below, she couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism stirring within her. Despite the challenges she had faced, she knew that she was stronger than ever before and ready to embrace whatever the future held. As she went about her daily tasks, Barbara couldn't shake off the feeling of freedom that came with reclaiming her independence. No longer shackled by the constant tension and resentment that had plagued her life with Jennifer, Barbara felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination to make the most of her newfound freedom. One afternoon, as Barbara stepped out onto her balcony to tend to her small container garden, she heard a familiar voice calling her name from the street below. Looking down, she saw James standing on the sidewalk, a warm smile on his face. "Mom, I brought you some groceries," James called up to her, holding up a bag filled with fresh produce and other essentials. Barbara felt a surge of gratitude wash over her as she made her way downstairs to greet her son. As James handed her the bag of groceries, she couldn't help but notice the look of concern in his eyes. "Are you doing okay, Mom?" James asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I know things have been tough lately, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Barbara smiled gratefully at her son, feeling a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate everything you've done for me. And I want you to know that I'm here for you too, no matter what happens." As James enveloped her in a warm hug, Barbara felt a sense of peace settling over her like a comforting blanket. Despite the challenges they had faced, she knew that their bond as mother and son would always remain unbreakable, guiding them through whatever obstacles life threw their way. With a renewed sense of purpose and determination, Barbara turned her gaze toward the future, ready to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead. And as she stepped back into her apartment, surrounded by the warmth and love of her family, Barbara knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them head-on, stronger and more resilient than ever before.